How do we create environments where trauma is understood, supported, and healed? Dr. Karen Treisman, MBE, has dedicated her career to answering this very question. From her groundbreaking books and resources to her global work in creating trauma-informed systems, Karen joins us today to share how we can move from awareness to meaningful action in trauma-informed care. If you are caring for someone else, whether paid or unpaid, and no matter how many hours you do it, did you realise that you may be missing out on thousands of pounds of discounts for things that you may use every day? The Able to Care podcast is proud to be sponsored by the UK's #1 carers card. Started by two best friends who recognise that carers deserve better and are 100% committed to helping to change the lives of all carers and bringing them together as a strong community. Carers Card UK provides support, recognition and rewards. It offers reassurance by providing an ID card that helps access emergency information when needed, while also unlocking discounts, a wellbeing hub, a carers circle tool and a community through their app. All of this for less than the price of a box of chocolates a year. There are discounts on gym membership, days out, electrical goods, clothing and even glasses. Let others know you care while taking a little care of yourself with an ID card you can be proud of. Visit carerscarduk.co.uk/promo code/able to care today to order yours. Welcome to the Able to Care podcast, where we delve into the stories and insights of those that make a difference in the lives of caregivers, educators, and families. Today, I am genuinely thrilled to welcome Dr. Karen Treisman, MBE, an award-winning clinical psychologist, author, and internationally recognized trauma specialist. Karen's work has transformed how we approach trauma in children, families, and organizations. She's the author of best-selling books like A Treasure Box for Creating Trauma-Informed Organizations and The Therapeutic Treasure Box. I sort of struggle to stumble over words on these, for developmental trauma. Today, we'll explore how trauma-informed practice can create lasting change from classrooms to care systems and how her resources and expertise continue to shape the field. So thank you so much for joining us today, Karen.
Oh, no, thank you so much for having me and for the amazing work that you do. It's lovely to be with you.
Well, I'm a little starstruck, so I'll do my best to muddle through because you are the Dr. Treisman. So, and obviously, thank you so much as well. I know you've just been delivering kind of 2 days of talking to 300 people. So you've been shouting for the last 2 days, and you've still managed to keep enough energy.
I apologise for the slight croak.
And thank you for keeping up the energy to keep going with me as well, because you've been working today. So. Yes. Right. We'll dive straight into it if that's okay. Obviously, we'll delve into a little bit on your career and stuff, but I want to kind of go straight into this term, trauma-informed. I hear it thrown around all the time. I constantly hear, and we're a trauma-informed school or a trauma-informed home and stuff like that. But there is so much of it that recognises that a lot of it is just lip service. They're ticking a box because it thinks it's what we want people to hear rather than actually understanding and embedding it into everything they do. Because I think that's one of the challenges, isn't it? It's not just something you pin at the end of a policy. It's an actual whole cultural change. So do you want to start off? How do you perceive or how do you explain what trauma-informed means?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I couldn't agree with you more. I think so often it's become the sexy thing, the fad thing, the sort of movement at the moment, and it's kind of banded around everywhere. We've got a fruit bowl in our reception and that's trauma informed, or we do a questionnaire and that makes it trauma informed, and so I think the word is used same as trauma has been used. I'm traumatized because of Love Island, or I'm traumatized because I missed the bus stop, and sort of has been misunderstood, sometimes diluted or overused. And it's a really hard thing to say in like a quick, concise way, because I suppose it's really unique whether it is trauma-informed in a parenting level, in a practice, whether it's in a local authority, a school, or at an organisational system, cultural-wide change. So I suppose those all have different definitions. But I suppose just in the sort of most way for a podcast way, firstly, trauma is the first bit of it. And even though people might call it different things, because some people don't like schools, for example, might prefer nurturing or relationship or, flourishing and not use the word trauma. Trauma does mean that we have some of the knowledge and the lens to understand the wider lens of trauma. So not just physical abuse or sexual abuse, but wider than, cultural trauma, intergenerational trauma, racial trauma, systemic, organizational trauma, but understanding how that trauma might influence or impact relationships, behaviors, decision-making, how we might cope or navigate or survive. And so to use that knowledge and theory to have a lens. But then there are a certain level of values and principles, which there's sort of 9 different ones, but really around safety and trust, transparency, cultural humility, so many different elements. And it really is around how do we take those values, principles, and lens and infuse it into how we use that for what we do, what we are, how we make people feel. And again, that's abstract because it's much easier when we give a specific example. But that's in a nutshell. How do we realize the impact and the prevalence of trauma and adversity and suffering and harm? How do we recognize how that might present or show itself in individuals, families, communities, organizations? What do we do to try and resist re-traumatization or adding distress or harm or being trauma-inducing? And then how do we respond, which is moving from knowing to doing to being and feeling? How do we take the knowledge and actually infuse that into how we might do our practice differently, or organizationally, how we might set up our organization in a different way? So that's probably a very vague, broad one, but in a nutshell.
To some degree, I think I really get the concept on an individual level. I thoroughly get the concept of being trauma informed. If you're either knowing or not knowing a person's history and stuff like that, there may have to be assumption. It isn't necessarily what's wrong for them and how are they feeling. It could be in what's happened in the past that could be presenting in the present. I think where I find it maybe harder to really get my head around how it can be utilized is at an organizational level. And why is it important to move from the individual to the kind of organizational or the whole structure?
Goodness, so many reasons. So I suppose, firstly, we know that if something is on a practice individual level, but it's not held in the wider environment or organization, there can be a mismatch and an incongruence. So, for example, if you're talking to foster carers about how they can be trauma informed towards their child, but that foster carer feels shamed, judged, or the processes that they need to go through, or the language that's used might be wonderful for them and their child, but the language that they have to do in their logs, or the language that happens in performance reviews, or what language they're exposed to in training, or the posters that are on the walls. There can be a real, I don't believe what you say because I see what you do, as James Treisman says. But also there's that whole thing of organizational culture, eat strategy for breakfast and lunch. So much of it is about staff well-being and wellness. It's about organizational and system trauma. It's about, for example, psychological safety. If you've got a team of social workers who feel that they can't say, I'm worried about this, or I'm struggling, or that's activating, or to whistle blow, or to be able to, then that in itself is going to cascade down massively to how able they are to be attuned or present. But take a school as an example. You might have a teacher who's really trauma-informed with her particular student, but if the class is not trauma-informed with the seating, the curriculum, with integrating brain breaks, Or even if the class is, but you go into a playground that is stress-inducing or fear-inducing, or staff don't have thinking spaces or reflective practice, or staff when there's a debrief, or what happens when there's been a suicide of a student, or if staff feel that there's fear-based leadership, or how they respond around Ofsted. So it's all of those, the policies, what happens around maternity policy and paternity and adoption policy, the physical environment. In a school, we know it's not just the teacher, it's business support, it's the caretaker, it's the maintenance, it's the lollipop person, it's, all of those bits around. So those are some of the, how we recruit staff, how we induct them. So that's some of the organizational kind of wider elements that are so important, that is quite different to practice, really.
Yeah, I think it's, as you said there, it's kind of trying to make it cultural. So it's just the norm, because I think it's, as you say, one person who is engaging in very, very, trauma-informed practice, but then stepping out that room. The self-care is a prime example, isn't it? That, working with individuals who've experienced high levels of trauma can be traumatizing yourself, secondary traumatic stress disorder and burnout and compassion fatigue and all of those elements. So if the organization isn't set up to help individuals to manage that, and there's so many care staff, particularly within children's services, I find that they have their own emotional baggage and trauma and stuff that they've had, they may not have processed yet. And that can mean that the emotional reactions of the child are then triggering for the emotional, for whoever is emotionally triggering for them. And you get this then domino effect of then the culture just deteriorates down as a result of that very, very quickly. So yeah, it's hard. What would you say are probably because where are the biggest challenges? When you said about the lollipop lady, I was thinking, I've never had somebody who supports the children to cross the road ever attend one of my trainings in things like behavior management or anything like that. I rarely get head teachers and managers on. This is one of my main bugbears. They'll stick their staff on it, go, oh, you need to do this training. You need to do behavior management training. But then and all the staff are kind of attending the training going, oh, this makes so much sense. Yeah, we need to address what we're doing. And I know the manager's not been on it. As soon as they walk out that door, the manager go, oh, we're not doing that. And it all falls down. What other of the challenges you've encountered of actually making that culture change?
I think there's so many different elements, and I think it really varies depending on the organisation and where they're at on the journey. I think particularly at the moment, one of the hardest things is we're in really thorny, spiky times. And I think, there's so much, whether it's the ripple effect of COVID, whether it's climate change, whether it's the NHS and social services being on their knees, whether it's people feeling overstretched and under-resourced and KPIs and outcomes. I think we've got so many people who are just struggling to get the basics, to literally teachers to have a pen, to, get a cup of tea, to go to the toilet. So I think when there's that sense of either feeling criticized or threatened or shamed or judged, or I'm just trying to hold something on, or I've spent my 30-year career talking about behaviors, or I think that can be a lot for people to be like, I'm already overwhelmed. But I think there's so many. I think a lot of it is if you have leadership who doesn't buy in, and then there is that sense of initiative fatigue. This is just another fad that's going to come, that's going to go. I think that thing you said about the lollipop person, I always say it's how do we help people see this is relevant to my job and role. So if I've got a security guard in social services, they don't need to know the ins and outs of trauma unless they want to, then of course they're welcome. But how do I help them feel seen, valued, appreciated, and to be like, how might a trauma lens and the values enhance and enrich my day-to-day role? If I'm a caretaker at a school, I don't need to know the minutiae and the ins and outs unless I want, but how could I use this information that will support when the fire alarm's gone off, or when a wall's being graffitied, or when someone has punched through? So I think partly people think, oh, it's for therapists or it's for frontline practitioners. So I think helping people see the relevance. I also think because it's been misused and thrown around and banded around, and there is a fear of, in schools, for example, is trauma-informed just being sweet, nice and kind? Or is it just excusing poor behaviour? Or are we letting people get away with murder? So I think some of those myths and misunderstanding, or is it assuming everyone's had trauma? That's what my next book is, by the way. It's all those questions and sort of saying the thorny bits. So I think those things can understandably be a bit of a block amongst many other implementation barriers, but a few that come to mind. Yeah.
Well, I'll say there has been a lot of kind of maybe, I mean, you use the word fads, so I'll carry on using that one, that have kind of come and gone. And obviously things like parenting strategies, have changed dramatically. And well, this is how you do it. This is it. We've changed our mind now and stuff like that. I mean, that is the nature of psychology and science that, I think everybody thinks, well, science should know the answers. Well, science by its very nature doesn't know the answers, which is why it keeps investigating. But I think that's where people do struggle a little bit. But that's it. Well, I was fine this way, and therefore, why do I need to change? And the other one you already mentioned as well, it's kind of just, it's allowing, or just let them do whatever they want then. And that's, I have come across that a lot, that they forget about the importance of boundaries. Boundaries is about safety, not about letting them do whatever they want.
Yeah. And that's that difference of helping people understand that tricky tightrope of connection before correction, and the importance of boundaries, but the difference between being punitive versus discipline, and helping honour and respect what are people's fears or apprehensions. And I think the other really important thing is honouring what people are doing already. And I think sometimes people come in and it feels like we're minimizing all the amazing work that's been done. And so I think supporting people to feel honoured and acknowledged and celebrated about there's amazing stuff that you're already doing, and how might this be a lens? It's not the only lens. It doesn't take away from neurodiversity or thinking about various other crucial elements, but how might we use it as a lens to enrich, and how does it actually tie into those other things that you're doing? Because when you break it down, if you take safety, for example, it'd be hard for people to be like, no, I don't think it's helpful for people to be safe. So I think when people are like, oh, I don't like trauma informed, it doesn't fit, I think that comes from an understandable hesitance or worry about change, or just needing to be like, what does that mean for me? What does that look like? And how can it be done in a respectful way, and that it's not saying this is better than other things. There is space and room for both, and it's the nuance within that.
I think it's a transition in the way that we kind of approach and understand or interact with other people, isn't it? That, our society is so based on old behaviorist mentality that, permeates psychology and understanding and society and cultures. And we're trying to move away from that. And I suppose I've been teaching for a long time. When I first started teaching, I taught a lot of health and safety courses, for instance, in care. The resistance I used to get is it's just red tape. Used to be called common sense in my day. And slowly people have come around to the idea going, yeah, it's pretty important though, isn't it? Like, it does keep us alive. It has reduced the number of deaths. But there's that resistance, like even putting seatbelts on when driving. I've been driving for years, never done me any harm. But now most of us recognise that somebody who doesn't put a seatbelt on is being a little bit careless and a bit silly. Do you think over time the mentality towards trauma-informed will shift over in that same direction? The acceptance of it will come over a period of time?
Yeah, I think that people are becoming much more thinking about humanising, relational, compassionate, nurturing, and even big companies, Amazon and Google know, if we want people to stay, how do we treat people and what does that look like? And the openness and seeing the positive impact on staff retention and staff well-being, and increasing stability of homes and reducing. So yes, I think there is also a hazard and danger because so many people are doing it in a way that talking the talk but not walking the walk. there is a hazard that it's the unintended consequences. And so I think often when people have had a painful or negative experience, they have that thing of, oh, it's trauma informed. And that can really sort of, I think, hold back. So I'm always encouraging people to not label yourself as trauma informed, because actually that can do more harm and hazard. And so I think there is definitely more interest, there's more movement, there's some brilliant pockets. I think if you look where we were 20 years ago to now, trauma informed really started big in the 60s. There's been so much kind of evolution, and I think that comes with amazing aspects, and it also comes with some bits of practice that might be being labelled as that, but probably isn't quite aligned with the approach or the model.
What do you think are the biggest kind of, you mentioned a few maybe already in what you've been speaking about, the most common kind of misconceptions around trauma informed? We said about, obviously, it's kind of letting kids do whatever they want to do. It's overly fluffy, and I think sometimes it's that perception, isn't it? There's still this old school mentality a little bit of, we need to toughen up. You build resilience through adversity, rather than through nurturing and acceptance. Is there any others, or is that kind of summarized the biggest misconceptions?
Oh no, I think there's loads of misconceptions. I think that is a big one, the sort of soft rainbows and fairies, making excuses. I think there's a lot around that it's trying to turn people into being therapists or psychologists, which it absolutely is not. I think there's a confusion between the difference between trauma specific and trauma informed at a practice level versus an organisation. I think that there is a huge misconception around trauma and the word trauma and what we mean by that. I think that a lot of people think it's really negative and problem saturated, and they're like, you're viewing everyone as trauma, as opposed to understanding it's a universal, inclusive approach, and actually there's huge elements of strengths-based. I think people don't quite understand the values. So they talk about the knowledge, but they don't quite get the application of the values. I think people think it's a new thing and don't realize that it actually started in the 60s, and there's lots of history and lots of, so many different elements. I also think the thing of people viewing trauma as like a car accident or a sexual abuse, and that someone, and not really thinking about adversity and pain and hurt and suffering and the wider lens. So many bits, but those are some of the first ones that come to my mind.
Yeah, that reminded me, actually, I was at a training session. I was watching one of my trainers deliver a course, and he was talking a little bit about trauma elements, but he was referring more to your more typical kind of simple PTSD-esque type trauma. And the group in there were I could see they were not quite connecting with the information he was sort of saying. And so do you think any of what he's been talking about is relevant to what you do? And we expanded it out, and they were a hospice. So they're working commonly with children who from a very young age had congenital conditions and stuff like that. So I said, how do you think that being woke up in the middle of the night and receiving injections from the moment you were born could have impacted on somebody in the way that they perceive the world, in how they've shaped and understand everything that happens to us from them on in? So it's trying to help them to understand that there isn't this one single event. It is all of the minutiae, all the little elements of life that can contribute.
And I think there's some systems when you talk to people that the word trauma can be a bit of a block or a barrier. And I think sometimes when we talk about hurt or pain or stresses or suffering or wounds, and the same as, I often get schools saying, well, we've only got two children in foster care. We don't need to be. And I'm like, well, you might only have 2 children in foster care, but what about all those children that we don't know, whether that's a parent who's dying, whether that is through being bullied, whether that's additional needs, whether that's new to the country, whether that's they've had a bereavement, whether that is, there are so many things, and not just for the children, but for the adults and our colleagues. And so I think helping people to think about things that might be overwhelming or scary, or that might make us feel that we don't belong, or we're excluded, or we're rejected, that we're trying to create environments that are as facilitative and enriching as possible. And that often with trauma, we don't know because it's camouflaged or it's masked or it's pre-verbal or it's in the in utero period or there's lots of shame around it. So I think there's also those bits of helping people think about the context and what that might mean or look like on an ongoing basis, so
the two main areas that I tend to teach in, I teach a lot around the children's sector, but I also do an awful lot around the elderly care sector. So we do an awful lot. And one of the things that I've noticed, and when I became educated about one, then suddenly it started to open my mind and go, oh, wait a minute, this isn't just for kids. This isn't just for people in mental health environments. One of the things very common for those living with dementia, their typical resilience strategies or the typical kind of coping mechanisms that they may have developed throughout life to manage and cope with early life trauma suddenly aren't there anymore. So you're getting that reliving of all of those trauma informed. And I think I often find, that for me, and you can please correct me if I'm wrong on any of this stuff, but I find that typically kind of the foster and adoption setting were kind of a bit of the front runners around trauma. Maybe they kind of led it. Then it moved into primary schools. We're slowly trickling a little bit into secondary schools, but there's a long way to go. And then we'll slowly, and some mental health units are now on it, very much so. But the elderly care sector is just nowhere near. Prisons, nowhere near. And probably secondary schools are probably just below prisons to some degree. But yeah, what's your experience on that? Do you find it, I don't know whether you only teach in children's services or whether it's you go across. I thought it was everything. Yeah.
Yeah, I do everything from elderly nursing homes to hospitals to HIV services to domestic violence shelters to, prisons to all sorts. So to me, it's that cradle to grave, womb to tomb. It's any setting that we can use and be helpful. And as you say, there's also a difference between one's chronological age and stage of needs and social, emotional and developmental. And especially because my work is often about the organisation, it's the culture, the organisational culture and organisational personality and identity and fabric. So that's for any organisation. And I think you're right in terms of there are certain settings that it just feels that it's been picked up more or gained more popularity, and other areas that are sort of still got a lot of room to do. That's why I wrote my book on trauma-informed healthcare, because I really wanted GPs and dentists and midwives and hospitals to really start forefronting this a little bit more, because I think it could make a huge difference. What I would say is I think there's pockets of brilliance in loads of places. So I know, for example, some phenomenal work happening in prisons, not just in the UK, but internationally. I know some brilliant work happening in some dementia services or some older adult services, but it is definitely the exception rather than the expectation. And so I think, I hope that we start to see lots of those different ones, if it's done meaningfully, not if it's the tick box tokenistic checklist. But yeah, I think there's so much around trauma and the role with dementia, but just older adults in general. We've got more older adults in prison than ever before. Yeah. We've got more older adults who have been, who have had diagnosis of HIV for a long time. We've got more older adults who now identify as trans or are part of the LGBTQ+I community. So there's so many sort of intersections between those different groups. And the staff, what it's like to work in, and the parent, the family members. So yeah, there's lots and lots of hopefully it filtering out into different places,
That's it. Yeah. As it gets moved around, hopefully more people become aware, more people have kind of got it in as part of their culture. If we can make it university as part of workplace culture generally. 100%.
And that's the dream, isn't it? That my dream would also be in the communities, like in theatres. You know, when you go to the theatre or when you go to a museum or you go to the library, that it's called almost trauma-infused communities would be the dream big. So yeah.
There's one woman who will help us get her there.
I'm trying to be a hopeful disruptor.
Absolutely. So obviously, you've done a TED Talk, and in that TED Talk, you spoke about relationships. It's so important in understanding behavior and why it's so crucial as part of your trauma-informed practice. And it was a case of like just human connection, isn't it? A little bit. Do you want to expand on that a little bit? On why relationships are so crucial for trauma-informed?
Oh goodness, that's a big old question.
It is, yeah.
I suppose, in its purest sense, as I say in that talk, relational trauma requires relational repair and relational healing. And we know that for many people, particularly those who have experienced attachment wounds, relational trauma, betrayal trauma, relational poverty, relational starvation, being in a relationship desert, their relational templates and prototypes and what they've absorbed has been different ways of doing relationships, being in relationships, and how to make sense of relationships. And I think for many people, relationships have been scary, wounding, rejecting, exploitative, all of the above. And the ripple effect that has, because we're interconnected. Dan Siegel says we should have the word we. There should be no word me, because there is no I. We are shaped within each other. And so I suppose the reason the relationship is so important is we know that social connectedness is such a buffering, protective factor, to feel that you're not alone, to have a sense of belonging and connection, to feel seen and heard and that you matter. But for people to have a reparative healing experience of relationships, and we know that has huge ripple effects into psychological safety and trust, into the energy that we show up in, relational regulation. So there's something so important about we do not exist in silos. We are relational creatures. And so we know it's like a teacher, the most classic example. If you really like your teacher, you are more likely to work harder. You're more likely to be more inspired. You're more likely to use it as a relational anchor. You're more likely to be able to take some of the advice that they might give you. And the opposite, if you really struggle with that teacher, it might feel more blaming, more attacking, more of a lecture, might feel uncomfortable, is likely to impact your energy, your presence. And so I think there's something, same as your manager at work from an organization, or, that relationship for how I might be able to ask for help or connect or show up is so important. So I think why the relationship is so important is because we're relational creatures, because we're interconnected, because of that but we need those connections. But also it's that collective care, it's that community care. We are born in relationships. And so I think there's so much around how we support people in that relational experience. So it's a big question, but that's the first random blurbs that come into my mind. I'm sure I give a far more articulate answer on a different time, but
Let me ask you a question. Do you ever find the pressures of supporting, teaching, or caring for someone else overwhelming and wish you had access to more support and information? The Able to Care podcast, in connection with Able Training, has created the ablehub.uk, where for less than the price of a coffee a week, you can access exclusive podcast content, resources, events, and over 45 certified online courses, covering topics like self-care, understanding dementia, neurodiversity, first aid, conflict management, financial advice, and so much more, with new content and courses being added each month. We are so confident that you will benefit from the Able Hub that we are offering 14 days access completely free of charge. No contract, cancel anytime. Become part of the ablehub.uk community and gain the support, knowledge, and resources you deserve. Don't struggle alone. Be able. Find the link in the description. I think. Do you think people are finding it more difficult in some ways to connect and to engage in relationships? I think whether it be, as we mentioned, the lockdown, but also this we are more connected than ever before, but we are less connected than ever before as far as we are connected through, well, like me and you are doing now. Yes, fantastic. We can do it through the medium of a virtual thing, but it'd be so much nicer to sit in a room with you, kind of absorb the whole kind of experience in the atmosphere and feel the warmth coming through. You know, it is a different experience. So it allows us to do things that we've never done before and be more connected. But there's this element of this disconnection. Do you think it's impacting?
Yeah, I think that it's same storm, different boat. And I'm mindful that it's also opened so many avenues for so many people. And there's lots of things that were very activating for some people that they don't, that they have different options and around accessibility and, you know, all the connections and all the rest. But yes, I think we know that whether that's because of AI, whether that is because of virtual working, whether that's because of closure of offices, whether that it was lockdown and kids not being in schools, whether that's because of mobile phones, you know, I think there is a sense of sometimes that kind of picking up the phone and having a chat or going and getting a coffee or that relational humanizing experience. For some, absolutely, there is more relational impoverishment and more relational bankruptcy. And for some people, some of those experiences of connections certainly has shifted and changed. So yes, I do think that has had an impact, and I think it lands differently for different people. But yes, do I think we've had a ripple effect from not just COVID, but from, you know, social media and from devices and even just, you know, change to community. Like it's quite rare, I think, that people, as they used to, go to a community dance or, you know, have a weekend fair. I know that happens in certain places, but, you know, so I think our community centres, loads of them have been shut down or closed or so yes, I think that, you know, many people who probably, certainly in London and the big cities, who probably don't know their neighbours or, you know, so, and people are working often, you know, longer jobs and in different, so yes. Do I think it's all bad? Absolutely not. Do I think it lands differently for different people? Yes. Virtual for me has been extraordinary and life-changing. But do I think that there is an impact on how we are relating to each other? Yes.
Yeah. I think, I've probably mentioned this on numerous podcasts before because it's always one of them. I probably talk about the same things over and over again quite often, but my listeners will just have to put up with it. As far as, you know, we talk about, we used to be raised by the village, you know, sister used to live over the road and auntie down the street. And slowly we've moved away to get to different jobs. We've expanded and stuff. And I think this is where organizations need to recognize that, going, well, we're missing that in the early stages of life. So we've got to provide it somewhere because it is something that humans need. I go to the gym and everybody just ignores each other. They're in their zone. They've just got their headphones in. Whereas used to be like, oh, you're right. And that may be all you got. But just that, you're right, is acknowledgement, is recognition, it's being seen for just a fraction of a second. And we're getting less of that than ever before.
Completely. And that's the same with having, and again, I love it. So as a personal, but, you know, things like Deliveroo, Uber Eats and Amazon, and you could basically get everything to your door without engaging. And again, for some people that's really fantastic, but for others where they don't necessarily have that support system or support network or collective care or community care, it might be that shop on the high street that someone used to, or the chat on the bus, or as you say, going to the gym or being in the park. And so some of those micro dosing of human interactions that I think for many people, let alone if you do not have access for technology or you know, not only certain generations, certain cultures, you know, around the impact of poverty. So again, it's a privilege to be able to have access to a laptop or to know how to use the forum that we're using, you know.
So all shops, make sure you got a cashier as well as your automatic queues. There we go. That's solved it. Give him choice.
That's one of the things that gets to me the most is the airport. That now, there's no one to check, are you going on the right aeroplane? And that you're checking, is my suitcase going to go to the right place?
Yeah.
That you just scan your suitcase and off it goes. And I'm like, I want to talk to a person to check that you've got my suitcase and that it's going to the right country.
Yeah, you still have to deal with the people you give your passport to get into the country, and they're not very friendly. So I'm quite happy you automate that a lot more.
That would be lovely. Yeah,
they're never happy. I don't know what happens to them outside of that job.
I know, not the best first impression. Airports could definitely be more trauma informed.
100%. Welcome to our country. 100%. So one of the things you've already mentioned and you've touched on is the importance of kind of providing that, helping people to self-regulate, to stay okay, especially if they're dealing with other traumatic influences or other situations. What's your suggestion or what are your key tips for organizations as far as promoting kind of self-care and helping people to self-regulate? Again, another big question. Sorry.
I know you're on it with the big questions. I love it though, but I feel like we need hours. So I do loads. That's what loads and loads of my work is around. And I think there's so many potential steps, and it really depends where people are at. Because if, for example, people don't have psychological safety or trust within the leadership, going and doing some of that, it's going to be talking the talk, but not walking the walk. It's that whole, I don't believe what you say because I see what you do. So I think there's lots of different things depending. I think, and it is different if you're a school, if you're local authority, if you're the police. Partly, I think one of the most important things is naming, as Dan Siegel says, name it to tame it, infusing the language of talking and normalizing, talking about moral injury and initiative fatigue and decision fatigue and emotional bandwidth, and framing it as an occupational hazard and normalizing. Like there's that quote by Rachel Remen, the expectation that you can walk through water and not get wet. The expectation that you can be a social worker and be marinated and soaked in hurt and pain and suffering and loss and injustice and not in some way be touched by that is as unrealistic as thinking you can walk through water and not get wet. So I think partly it's through conversations and training that normalize and validate. But then I think there's all those elements that I do in lots of my training around, there's all the bits from how we recruit and induction, how we do meaningful well-being plans, how we help to teach people about micro-dosing, that they're not waiting for the gym or the holiday or the pub, but what am I doing in those micro moments when I pop to the toilet or, when I'm having a brain break after a phone call. I think it's having access to things like thinking spaces or spaces of solidarity or healing circles, the physical environment. And there's so much we can do to make the physical environments more relational. And if it's virtual, what do we do to help people feel connected? So I think there's a lot of things about the practical bits and then the organizational stuff of people feeling appreciated, people feeling valued, the language that we use, how if there is someone who is contaminating or polluting the team, how does action happen so that we're protecting the culture of the organisation? How do we have meaningful training opportunities and development opportunities? How do you have a menu of options so it's not we all do this or that people feel patronised, right, all of you go to the gym. Well, what if someone can't go to the gym or doesn't want to go to the gym? Well, that's not helpful. How do we honour and respect flexibility? So I think there's so much around teaching people about how do you upregulate and how do you downregulate. What are some things you can have around you? And then using some of the things like appreciative inquiry and narrative therapy type questions and having examples of best practice. And so, millions and millions of things. But it is so important that we value you and we see you and that we're not treating you like human conveyor belts,
Do you think there is? Do you think that's where it falls into the kind of the tick box criteria, that there is a case of, well, we've given you a kind of a cheaper option to go to the gym and therefore tick, we've done self-care and stuff like that. Do you think, is that what you come across sometimes from some settings?
So often. So I think partly it's things like there's been a suicide in a school. Right, let's bring a psychologist tomorrow to do a 1 hour and then that's it. No one else talk about it again. Bish, bash, bosh, we're done. Other times it's making people feel you are the problem and you need to go on resilience training. And for anyone who's listening, I'm doing that in speech marks because I don't use that word. But also absolutely that thing of we've done a one-off training and that's it. We don't need to talk about it again, or it's not infused or felt, or people will say things like your well-being's really important, but then expects them to reply to an email at 3 o'clock in the morning, or will position someone as not coping or make someone feel like they need to, again, in speech marks, soldier on. So I think that happens a lot, that it's tick box or tokenistic or shaming, or it's felt as it's like a one-off thing, as opposed to this is an ongoing, infusing, little and often talking about it, that it's something that is not a one-off, that it's something that is embedded and infused into not just kind of what we say, but who we are.
It's fascinating speaking to you because we come from quite different kind of ways. I'm very much on the individual basis, and you've got this kind of whole kind of view, which in some ways is so much more important as far as, because if the culture isn't there, I may have a room of 12. I'm trying to teach, look, this is how you can manage on a day to day. And I'm teaching about self-care to foster parents and things like that. But if the organizational isn't there to support that framework, then it all becomes, they're fighting another losing battle. And I think there's an interesting thing maybe so I did it on a course where I kind of got them to, it was foster parents, and I asked them on a scale of 1 to 10, how important did they feel self-care was? And they all put 10. Of course they all put 10. Then I said, on a scale of 1 to 10, how often or how good do you think you are at actually instigating it? And then most of it was 3s and 4s and stuff like that. I said, so there's a disconnect there in the fact that I don't believe you really think it's a 10. You say self-care is a 10, but I think you're playing lip service to what you think I want to hear or what you think you should say rather than genuinely believing it. If I ask you how important you think food is to survival, you'd probably say 10. And if I asked you, well, how often do you make sure you eat at least once a day? I think you'd all be putting 10 because they are so synonymous with each other. And I suppose even if an individual level, well, it's individuals that are then managing the hierarchy. So if individuals are thinking about that about themselves, then the same thing is going to kind of filter down from the top.
Completely. And it's the both and, because I think the two things that you said there, where I start, because I do lots of work with foster carers and adopters and various, is I first start with the why and the theory. Because if you go into, let's all do a breathing strategy, or it's almost that sense of like we need to start with like, why is this important? And we're going up against society's thing of, oh, it's selfish and, you just get on with it and toughen up and soldier on and all of this guilt. And so I think so much of it is really spending time that people really soak in and understand, why is it important and what hazards happen if I don't? Like I always talk to my social workers, it's an ethical duty. It's an act of resistance against becoming blocked or shut down or losing your spark or having crushed empathy or, physically being there and emotionally not, or dehumanizing people. So I think that understanding secondary and vicarious trauma and the importance is so important before diving into the tools, which is what people usually want. But the other bit from what you just said is about you focus lots on the individual. To me, there is so much merit. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm a therapist through and through. And so to me, there's the both and. I want to work on shifting a prison, as an example. And I know that's going to have so much bigger impact on everyone who interfaces. But whilst I'm doing that, I also have people every day that need the support. So I think there's that thing of, what can we do to support the individual in that moment, that every interaction is intervention to support, whilst also thinking about the system. And some people will focus on one and others. I tend to do the both and. Because I think it's that thing of, if I just focused on the big policies and procedures of the prison, I'm not going to be able to support the person who is there on the Monday who needs my help. If I just focus on the person on the Monday, it's not going to have a future impact on the systemic and on the wider. So we kind of there's room and space for both and, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is so important that for organizations to truly get on board with the trauma informed, it can't just be some training we give the staff on a Monday. We've got a spare inset day. Let's pull somebody in to come and do a talk. As you said, it's not enough. It's got to be infused. It's got to become that kind of culture shift. Yeah. So let's just touch a little bit about your journey, if that's all right, because obviously, trained clinical psychologist, author of. I mean, you are, as I've already said to you, a machine when it comes to books, because your books as well, they are, I mean, I had to carry them with me this morning, and I love your books but I'm just going to hold them up for those of you watching. They are just 3 of the books that you've done.
Yeah. Get good muscles from those, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Is that why you wrote them, just to give a workout? Obviously, they're jam-packed full of stuff. And one of the things I really like about them as well, they are very practical in their approach. It's not just a kind of a textbook. So although it may look quite intimidating, there's so many kind of worksheets and visuals and stuff that people can use as takeaway and kind of, hey, let's introduce this straight into our practice and do something from it. What inspired you to start writing and not just teaching? What was the inspiration?
Yeah, do you know, it's a really interesting one, because if you would have asked me when I was training to be a psychologist in a million billion years, I never would have said that I would write a book. I didn't enjoy writing an essay. And so it's always quite a strange thing that I've got, I think, soon to be 15. So yeah, and I've got so many more that I'm working on and plans to come. I think a few things. When I was training to be a psychologist, so many of our lectures were like, you need to work to support the person to improve their self-esteem, or, to reduce the anxiety. And I was like, well, I know that. How do I do it? So I really wanted that, like, practical tools and strategies. But also, a lot of my life I have spent in other countries, throughout Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, in various bits, where I am a huge believer of not everyone can access or needs or responds to therapy, that there is huge amounts in parenting, in caring, in teachers, in the community. And actually, what can we try to do to not expect people to be therapists or psychologists, because that is absolutely not, and that's not ethical, but what can we do to actually do things in a more meaningful, enriched, relational way? And to help, if people are already going on Google and getting stuff, what can we do to try and make it practical and things that people can go and do and hold on to? And I had this real passion. At heart, I'm an artist. I'm far more an artist than a psychologist. And so I wanted to find a way to bring my love of stories and creativity and art to make psychology more real world, to make it more accessible, and to sort of spread it in that respect and in that way. But also, as a psychologist, I can't tell you how many times I would have my social workers come to me and ask me the same question. What are some strategies I can do? I've got a child who's struggling to, sleep at night, or what can I do to help teach a child about their feelings? And so I was like, I'm literally repeating everything over and over again. So I'm going to try and create some worksheets and create some visuals. And then I was like, well, actually, I really want this to support and benefit other practitioners and foster carers and parents. And so that kind of inspired the books, I should say.
Yeah. Well, the therapeutic treasure box is that's what it is, really, isn't it? It's kind of jam-packed full of ideas, worksheets, activities and stuff like that. And I think there's cards as well that go with that, isn't there, as well? So like additional stuff. Yeah.
I've got 5 sets of cards, and also I've got online modules that sort of talk people through if they want more as to sort of how to use the cards in more meaningful, enriched ways. And I think the thing about all of the resources is they're not prescriptive. I try to encourage, if you're super busy, as for example, my social workers are, you can go and photocopy something and have a folder and a file and use it. Or if you don't feel naturally creative, that I'm sort of supporting you to do that in busy, pressurized places. However, what I encourage people is, I might have given an example using a football, but if you've got a kid who loves rainbows, do the same concept using a rainbow. If you've got a kid who likes Angry Caterpillar or Harry Potter. So I'm really trying to use it as a springboard, but for people to then be able to tailor or adapt it to the specific context and make it better than I have. Add things and explore and discover, but to just have a little bit of a baseline to create more discovery and exploration, really.
And obviously I've shown the 3 very adult books, really, haven't I? But obviously you've also created numerous books for children as well, to kind of help and give resources for adults to kind of share with children as well. Is there more children's books in the...
Yes, there are. So I've got 6 or 7 currently out. I actually can't remember. 6 or 7 currently out. I've got ones on bereavement and grief, anxiety, emotional regulation, emotional literacy, self-esteem and strengths, nightmares and sleep difficulties, trauma, but those who externalize. I've got 2 more that are due to come out. One is called This Is Me, that is sort of the identity, hopes, wishes, feelings, all about me activities. And I've got another one coming out called Taya the Tortoise, that is for children who have experienced trauma and abuse. But instead of my Cleo the Croc, that's for those children who externalize or learn better attack than be attacked, Taya the Tortoise is for those kids who retreat, shrink from the world, disconnect, go quiet, internalize, or dissociate. So those are the 2 that will be out. I don't know when, but over the next few months, I suppose. So, yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you a difficult question now. I know this is going to be a difficult question for you. Okay. So obviously, especially with about having 15 books. But okay, so what would be your maybe top 3 favorite activities or favorite elements of some of your books that you would want other people to kind of know about?
I think my 3 favorite, first one that comes to my mind, this is one of those things that I'll get off the call and be like, oh, that's not my favorite, I'll say something else. But first ones that come to my mind is, I've got one that is the tower or skyscraper of strengths or tools. And I love that because it can be done with Lego, with Jenga, with Post-its, with my strengths cards. And it can be individual strengths, family strengths, organizational strengths, community strengths. And it's not just about creating the tower. We could have a whole skyscrapers of a cityscape if it's a class or a family. And to me, it's about the questions you ask in it. So it's not just a kid saying, for example, I'm kind. It's like, and what does kind mean and look like to you? And where did you learn to be kind from? And when was the last time that kindness visited? And if kindness was a colour, and can you tell a story of when kindness was there? And, who else would describe you as kind? So it's a lovely visual and one that could be added on. So that's definitely one of my favourites. I also like lots of the ones around externalizing a particular feeling. So I can't remember which are in which book, but I think in the therapeutic treasure box, I've got ones for anger, sadness, happiness. And so we're encouraging, including adults, instead of just saying, happy, it's like, if happiness was a color, if happiness was a shape, if happiness could talk, what might it say? If happiness was a smell or a sound, where does happiness visit in your body? So it really helps to do that meaning making and that sense making and that emotional texture. So I think that would be, and my favorite one from the Creating, I don't even know the name, isn't that bad? Trauma-informed organization book, is my step-by-step worksheet that goes through how you can take a particular element of an organization, like a panel, a team meeting, your playground at school, a policy, and gives you a bunch of experiential activities to reflect on your playground from a more trauma-informed perspective, or how you can make your team meeting have more psychological safety or be more collaborative. So it takes something that's quite overwhelming and big, especially when I go through it with people in training, and it makes it feel much more doable, manageable, tangible. So yeah, probably loads more, but those are the first three that popped into my head.
No, that's fantastic. And I think anybody kind of listening to this will kind of hopefully search those out. And I think they're lovely activities. And I think although there is an element of maybe childishness to the activities, there's also not. I think it would be so beneficial for any adult. We all think we know what happiness is, but as you say, like, well, but what color is it to you? What would happiness say to you? I think that emotional literacy we kind of take for granted that as adults we should know by now, but I think we're quite ignorant of it for most of us. I try and raise awareness of this for most people, that, you know, one of the things when you're learning to be a psychologist or therapist, whatever it is, one of the first things you start doing is exploring feeling words. You need a huge emotional vocabulary to be able to recognize all the kind of the complexity and nuance of emotions. It's huge.
Yeah, and that is one of the things that I am most passionate about, is extending things to ourselves and adults, because I think there is this thing of, oh, it's babyish or it's patronizing or the expectation. But absolutely, if it's done in a respectful, honoring way, actually, absolutely being able to answer questions in different ways, to enrich the emotional texture, to do the nuance, to be able to think about things differently. And I think for most of us, actually, to do a collage or a vision board or to depict something out of miniatures, of course, when it's done respectfully and with those things, it can be so powerful. And I think you were talking about losing some of the humanness in the relationships. I think we need to bring more creativity and playfulness and joy back into our meetings, back into supervision, back into our interactions, because it can enhance things in so many ways. And so often we know that feelings are encoded in sensations, in our gut instinct, and that we can cognitively talk about something, but when it's at a body base, it's different. So yeah, love that you said that, because I really, really, really think we need to do more playfulness, creativity, joy, as much for adults and in organizations that we do for children. You know,
I recognized it in my own organization as a training company. As we've kind of grown, there's been times when, you know, running any organization is hard, and it's easy to get distracted with the outcomes, the KPIs, as you mentioned earlier, and stuff like that. And I realized last year that that's something I was doing. I was starting to focus on the bottom line and the KPIs and put a lot of pressure on my staff to kind of need to achieve. And actually productivity and well-being was going down as a result. So change things up. So you mentioned vision boards. We did vision boards. That was our project at the end of the year, of what do you want next year to look like? What do you want for your next 5 years? What are we working towards here? What's your reason for turning up to work every day? We do fun Fridays once a month, where we kind of either go for a walk or we bring in food together. And we have motivation Mondays, reflection Fridays, and all of the philosophies that are in there and in your books and stuff like that. It doesn't matter what organization it is. It's little bits. And as you said, you referred to it as microdosing. It doesn't need to be a huge 15 minutes at the beginning of the day could change the outcomes for an entire group or organization throughout the day as a result of that. Yeah. So, yeah. Well, it has been amazing chatting to you, Karen. I think I could genuinely listen and chat to you for ages. I've got like a million more questions, but I kind of cut down and just went, we'll just do those today. But I will come and see you live at some point, and we'll have to meet in person, because that would be amazing. And but yeah, so thank you so much for joining us. And
thank you.
It's been...
Hopefully we'll do a part 2 at some point. And thanks, Andy, because it's for anyone who's listening, we did not discuss whatsoever what we were going to talk about. And I think that's just the lovely bit, isn't it, of just both showing up and just bouncing and synergy. So it's been a joy, and thank you for inviting me.
Oh, that's absolutely my pleasure, and it's an honor. So for anybody listening who found the stuff that we've talked about useful, interesting, or important, please like, comment, and share this podcast with others as well. The details of how you can find some more stuff from Karen, her books and her work and her website will all be in the show notes and the description. So please look out for those and reach out and connect with her and invite us to your organization to come and do more than just an hour of talking. Come and change your culture. But for any organization out there, there is the little steps you can start taking to, I do hate the box ticking Barry for anything. So therefore, let's really take that trauma-informed practice and ingrain it. But for now, thank you very much again, Karen. And we'll have you back soon. Have you ever encountered an adult or child's behavior that has felt difficult, overwhelming, or challenging? Have you sometimes felt at a loss of what to do, or know that you didn't handle it quite right? People are complex and unpredictable, and their behavior can be like the weather. We've all made the mistake of looking out the window and feeling safe to wear shorts, but 5 minutes later, wishing for an umbrella. But what if, like a weatherman, you understood how humidity, temperature, and pressure all come together to cause the weather, allowing you to better prepare, predict, and respond, and prevent ever having a picnic ruined by a thunderstorm ever again? My book, called Targeting the Positive with Behaviors that Challenge, helps you to become the weatherman of behavior. It provides you with a toolkit to increase competency, confidence, resilience, and empathy, so you feel more assured about how to respond to distressed or dysregulated behaviors in others, including those affected by trauma, mental health, neurodiversity, learning disabilities, or dementia. Build better connections, achieve de-escalation, and improve outcomes for yourself and those you engage with my celebrated 6-stage target model, a step-by-step process to reduce distress for everyone. Discover my empowering, person-centered guide in Targeting the Positive, written by me, Andy Baker, available from online bookstores worldwide. Find a link in the description and order today.